So let's start first with my favorite method of marking, and that is using a light box. This is just an inexpensive light box. I think it's an LED light. It's a very bright, but it's not super hot, which is really nice. And then this pattern comes from the block number 1 pattern from the Machine Quilting Block Party this year. And what you want to do is print out the design pages, make sure that they come out the right size, and you cut them out and tape them together, and that becomes your pattern. And then once you tape them together, you just place that on the light box and layer on top your quilt block. Now this method is marking from the back, so the design's on the back, the quilt block's on the front. If you don't have a light box, you could use a bright window, something like that, where it would shine light through. I've even heard of quilters using like a glass top, like a coffee table, and then putting a light underneath it, and that works as well. And so you can see the design through it, and then you grab a marking pencil and just mark those lines. Now let's talk a little bit about marking pencils as I mark this. Marking pencils are not all created equal, and it is extremely important to test your marking pencil and make sure that it's going to come out of your fabric before putting any marks on your block. And the reason for that is if this doesn't come out, those marks will be permanent. They're not going to be going anywhere, and that would look really unsightly on your block. You want the marks to be there long enough for you to quilt it, and then you want them to disappear. It's the vanishing act, and that's really important to your quilts, just to make sure that those marks come in long enough for you to quilt along them, but then they go away. So my favorite marking pencils are the ones that I'm using here. I like this. This is a fine line water-soluble blue pen, and you can see it marks a nice, very thin blue line that's easy to follow whenever you're quilting, but it washes out completely in water, and we will learn how to wash out our blocks so that way it removes this marking, and it also removes the starch that we put into our fabric when we were preparing it. So you can see how nicely that marks the block. Now for darker fabrics, like where I'm going to be marking this vase, I'm going to use a ceramic marking pencil. So this marks over medium to dark fabrics, and it marks a really nice fine white line, and that's really easy to follow as well. It's important to have a thin line simply because if it's really thick and chunky, that can kind of change your quilting design. And it also, I find that the thicker, chunkier lines are harder to follow and not to wash out. And that would be the worst thing, is for it to look, almost like a crayon all over your quilt. And then, of course, not to wash out. That would be pretty bad. So this is the first method, and this is my most preferred method. But I know that not everyone has a light box. Not everyone has this ability to mark this way. So now let's move over, and we're going to talk about some alternatives to marking that don't require a light box. So the next method of marking involves making a template, and I've included some templates to marking the border design in all of our blocks in the Machine Quilting Block Party. So the first step is to print this out, and always double check the 1-inch square on these pieces. You want to make sure they print out accurately. It's on letter size paper, no scaling, no shrinking. Make sure to print at actual size, and that 1-inch box needs to measure 1 inch. So you're going to take a piece of paper and just roughly cut out your template, and then you're going to take some more freezer paper and just cut it in half and press it down onto a hard, firm pressing board. And then take the other half and press it on top. What we're doing here is we're making a very rigid, stiff template. And this is essentially a stencil that you can use multiple times in order to mark your block. So now I'm going to top it with our template that we're going to use to cut out. And this is super hot. I'm using a hot, dry iron, and all of this is waxy side down on the freezer paper, so that way it all sticks together. And you can see as I peel it up, it forms a really nice rigid sheet. It's real hot right now, so I don't really want to touch it, but you can see it forms this really nice rigid sheet. It's easy to use. So now we're going to take and cut out these pieces in order to create stencils. So here I've already cut out my spiral, and you want to cut this out very carefully on the outline, and then also cut into it along that spiral line all the way into the center. And if you cut carefully, you can create this. And because we've layered it with 3 layers of freezer paper, you can see it might be a little floppy, but it's quite rigid and it's going to hold its shape. So that's really, really nice to use. Now for our echo shell stencils, we're going to cut this out. And the reason I gave you 4 is for a very good reason. The first thing you're going to cut out is just the shape itself. So cut out 1 template so it looks like this. Your next one you want to cut out, and you want to cut out just the 3 rings and cut off the outer ring. So basically that's going to be a stencil that will help you mark that line. Now when we start cutting into the inner ones, it can get a little tricky and a little floppy. So here I've cut out the outer line and then I've cut inside along that shape. So that way I can mark that line easily. And then the last one, I've just cut out, notched out that little arch shape. So with these 4 stencils now, I can use these to mark those echo shell shapes in my border. So let me show you how to use them. So the first thing to do is start on a corner, and you want to just line this up with a straight line to that seam line and just mark. And I'm using the ceramic marking pencil here. I know I can erase it out with the tip of the marking pencil after I'm done, but it forms this nice thin white line that's really easy to follow. So I'm just going to work my way down, and I'll mark 3 of these echo shapes going that way, and I'm just going to mark the outermost line here just so that way I can line everything up nicely. So now I'll start back at the next corner. Again, line that up, mark the outline. And I do think it's important to go on ahead and mark just this outermost shape, the biggest shape you've got, all the way around the block, and that be your first step. So that way it's kind of evenly spaced. If you have to do any fudging or squishing things together, you can do it right here where it's not going to be very noticeable. So you can see here, I'm just a little bit off over on that corner, no big deal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark half of it, I'm going to shift the template over slightly, mark the other half of it, and no one will know that one's ever so slightly smaller, and you would never know that. So once you mark all of the big shapes, then you can go inside and mark your extra echoes using these extra templates. So here all I do is just center it up, and you can just visually do this. It doesn't have to be exact. Make sure that line is lined up on the seam line and mark around it. And then grab your next one, and this should fit in 2 places. It should fit the outline, and it should also help you mark that inner line. And then your last one fits in there just like that. And so you can see why you mark the bigger ones first. It just helps you line everything up. And that's how that will work. Okay? Now your corners can be a little tricky, and I do think it's important going ahead and mark the big guys here so that way it's easy to line up your corner circles. So here's this one marked, and then now place the circle in the corner, and I want to make sure that it's lined up. It's going to hit those 2 echo shell shapes, and then the spiral is going to start right here along that edge. Now I'm just going to mark the outline, and then we cut away. I cut away through that spiral, and if I'm real careful, I can just sneak in there with the tip of my pencil and just lightly mark through the middle, and I'm trying to hold on to it and hold it firmly down while I mark at the same time. It's a little bit of a juggle, but once you get in there pretty good, you can probably freehand that, meaning like you don't need a stencil or anything. You can just kind of eyeball it, and you don't even have to fill that in there with a circle if the spiral if you don't want to. If that looks a little too dense to you, you can just mark the outline, just mark the circle, and that's perfectly fine too. So now let's learn one more method of marking. This involves freezer paper. So this is a template you can print out on the paper side of freezer paper. It's got a waxy side and paper side, and you want to print this out and make sure that it's full size by measuring that 1-inch box. That should always measure exactly 1 inch. So you want to take this template and cut it out and center it over the flower area on your quilt block. And I cut it out inside the line a little bit so that way I can see those seam lines. When I go in to stitch this block in the ditch, I'll be able to see those seam lines real easily and be able to stitch really accurately. I don't want it overlapping those edges. So get it centered up real nice. If you want to, you can take a hot iron and press this in place. I don't want to do that because I've got water-soluble pen mark out here and I don't want to heat set it. Now, you do need to place this template at a specific time in the process, and you can tell this block has been basted. So first I pen basted it, then I basted it a second time with water-soluble thread. That's this thread that's running over the block, and it's going to completely wash out after the quilt is done. And the reason I did that is so that it'd be nice and stable and there wouldn't be pins in the way, so that I could place this template and it wouldn't be all lumpy and bumpy because of all the pins in it, right? So I can just place this and I could stitch around it with more water-soluble thread, and that would be a good way to secure it. Or I could just pin it in place, that would work too. When I go to quilt this, I'm going to quilt on all of the mark lines through the paper, through the quilt all at once. Now, in order to make the paper easy to tear away afterwards, I want to make sure to stitch with really tiny stitches. So as you're quilting, make sure to move your hands very slowly as you form this design, and that will produce really tiny stitches. Another idea that can help make the paper easier to tear away is to stitch over it twice. So stitch that center circle first, then stitch over it again, and that'll make it easier to tear away later. When you're tearing the paper away, just be really gentle, go slow. I like to use like a ruler or even the kind of blunt end of a seam ripper, and I kind of put some pressure and tear the paper very, very carefully. You want to be careful because sometimes this can pull your stitches a little bit. It can put a lot of pressure on them, but it's still a wonderful method for marking, where you're marking from the surface. You don't have to use a pen or pencil. You don't have to worry about washing any marks away. So this is a method that a lot of quilters really like to use, and I'd like to show it to you so that way you can see how it works. So that's it for this video. I hope that you've enjoyed learning more about quilt marking. If you have any questions, you can definitely ask in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel so you get an email every time I upload a new video. Until next time, let's go quilt.